What is the meaning of the word conservative? This is partly a direct answer to that question, and it's partly a little bit more of a broad set of reflections on how this relates to the current challenges we're facing in vegan politics. Veganism is a message without a movement in many ways. It's an important message, and we're trying to get organized to be a powerful movement in different countries around the world. Some countries obviously are ahead of others. If anyone's watching this video in Tel Aviv, they'd say, what do you mean it's a message without a movement? But on the other hand, if you're watching this in Paris, France, we just talked to a French vegan we met at a restaurant here the other day, you'd be saying, yeah, that's about accurate. In Paris, France, this is a message without a movement. All right, the meanings of terms like left and right are used in the English language in politics. Something to be left or left-wing politically, right-wing politically. They're used as if they have self-evident, constant, reliable meanings. But if we just stop and kvetch about it for a minute, we all know that actually the meanings of these terms change from decade to decade and from place to place. From one culture to another, from one period of time to another, from one country to another, and sometimes even within the same country. What you mean by calling someone a liberal in Texas may not be the same as what's meant by a liberal in Los Angeles within the United States of America. But I noticed that in the last couple of years, because of the decaying utility of the word liberal itself, the meaning of the word liberal has really become diluted and obfuscated. It's become difficult to use the word liberal with a straight face anymore. More and more, the term that's used in English, I think, is progressive. People talk about progressive politics. Now, this is an incredibly biased term. The meaning of the word progressive is we, collectively as a culture, have some kind of list of issues on which we feel the way forward is clear. The direction of progress is known and not open for debate, and anyone who opposes the progress of those issues is a regressive or a conservative, whereas those who support progress in those areas, on those issues, in those directions, is a progressive. This is a massively, massively biased term. There are people on this earth who identify as conservative, who describe themselves, who will say they are conservative. However, nobody identifies as a regressive. Nobody wants to identify themselves as an enemy of progress. And on the other hand, we all know it's completely self-serving to define your own cause simply as one of progress. It just means you're right. That's all it means. Anyone who disagrees with you is wrong. Now, in the not-too-distant past, around the year 1989, of course, the whole of the left was shocked and challenged because the concept of progress, the concept of the way ahead for socialism, for communism, but for the left in general, was massively stirred up by the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the fact that everyone recognized that communism had been a disaster in Russia, in China, also in smaller communist states like Vietnam, Laos, Cuba. There was this moment when the whole of the left had to stop and reconsider, wait, what is it we're supposed to be progressing towards? And I think the use of progressive actually did drop out of circulation for a few decades there. But in those same few decades, we had the rise of first neoconservatism and then neoliberalism. The word liberal started to become meaningless, and now here we are today, where it's a really legitimately contestable question. What do any of these words mean, especially if you're in international politics, especially if, like someone like me, I deal with politics in Japan and China, not to mention Sweden, England, Ireland, or something, once in a while. I'm interested in politics in North Africa. I'm interested in politics. We've been doing a lot of reading lately and a lot of worrying lately about politics in places like Yemen, too. Just within this, me and my girlfriend spent a lot of time talking about Yemen lately. Anyway, it's pretty much World War IV in the greater Saudi Arabia part of the world these days. My point is, if you have an international focus, then the meaning of any of these terms starts to become dubious indeed. Textbook political science would give you the following answer about the meaning of the word conservative, and it links to the origin of the terms left and right, as in left-wing and right-wing within politics. The unique origin story for the word conservative is linked to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, he wasn't a conservative, ironically, but on one specific issue he was considered conservative, and that was his criticism of the French Revolution. Now, on that issue, of course, he proved to be right. It's difficult to put yourself back in history, put yourself in the role of a normal reader, someone who just read the newspapers of the day. They did have newspapers back then, of how crazy Edmund Burke's warning about the French Revolution would have sounded at the time. Edmund Burke was a guy who, in the early stages of the French Revolution, rang the alarm bell saying this is going to end in kind of mass murder and the collapse of society. I don't think he ever used the term mass murder, but still, if you read it, the original source, you can see his point is there. That sounded crazy. All kinds of people in England said, why would you? This is fear-mongering. This is demonizing the French Revolution. Come on. The French Revolution made some obvious steps in the right direction. In terms of progress, the French Revolution was, for example, opposed to slavery. These people say they're going to abolish slavery. They're going to replace dictatorship. They're going to replace aristocracy with democratic system of government. Sounds good, right? Well, Edmund Burke didn't just ring the alarm bells. It turns out that his alarm was right. The French Revolution did indeed go on to massacres. But what's important to note here in terms of the meaning of the word conservative still today is why he made that inference, why he made that judgment, why he made that prediction, and that does link in a profound and meaningful sense to what conservative still means now. Edmund Burke's analysis was based on what we would today call folk ways. Folk ways, or you could just say customs, like the customs of the common people, right? He does not write this in a sort of schematic or analytical fashion. To be honest, this theory really appears like a series of emotional outbursts throughout his book, his critique of the Revolution of France. As I recall, that book was originally a letter. That was the golden age of letter writing, from one person to another. And it was a private letter that was to some extent edited and made into book form. So it's perhaps not even as formally written as some of his other writing. But in any case, if you try to read that book today, you might feel you're kind of reading the disorganized thoughts of a blogger in 21st century terms. But nevertheless, he very sincerely warns that the reality of how democracy works, not even just democracy, he was lukewarm about democracy. His fundamental judgment about England, so this is still debatable today, was that the people of England were too stupid and too poorly educated to have democracy. Therefore, they needed an aristocratic system. They did have a semi-democratic system with an aristocracy on top to defend them from themselves, to prevent the people from running amok, which is indeed what happened in the French Revolution to some extent. Of course, it's the truth. The truth, of course, was more complicated than that, but nevertheless. Look, this idea of folk ways and customs, that relationships of authority, social stability, most of what is good in our society doesn't rely on written law, doesn't proceed from a kind of rational system created by a king or a dictator or a democratic parliament. That there's this body of kind of uncounted principles and beliefs in how the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker all get along. The substance of social harmony itself, and to a large extent also the day-to-day reality of I guess you'd say, trust, human interactions, social cohesion, and indeed authority, relationships with authority. This comes down to folk customs, folk ways, we'd now say. And the reason why he warned the French Revolution was so dangerous was that this was going to tear apart the basis for social harmony itself. And then society would collapse into a kind of orgy of violence, internecine fighting and mass murder and what have you. Now, the whole history of the world would be different if he'd been wrong. I mean, what if the French Revolution had settled down into a kind of stable, reliable democracy? What if anything other than the Great Terror had happened? So the later period of the French Revolution is referred to as the Great Terror. And then significantly, in terms of this theory of folkways and folk customs, the French Revolution did return to a customary form of monarchy and indeed monarchical despotism, because what happened next was Napoleon, the dictatorship of Napoleon. Right, so that's a long story we're not going to get into. But it's interesting, this concept of conservatism, and Edmund Burke is still formally named in every political science textbook as the first conservative, as the man who defined conservatism, because he's the one guy who stood up at a time when in England almost everyone was kind of applauding at least the potential of the French Revolution to be a great and wonderful thing for the future of the world. He's the one who stood up and said, no, this is going to end in massacres, and it turned out he was right. Why was he right? Because of this concept of social authority, social authority, cohesion, custom, etc. And still to this day, you can say that conservatives are, positively, the people who value those folk ways. Now here's the problem, and here's why this is, I think, worth talking about in relation to veganism. The meaning of folk custom, or you could say in a Republican Party sense, of traditional values, right? What are traditional values in Texas, and what are traditional values in Manhattan? What are traditional values in Saudi Arabia? What are traditional values in Sri Lanka? Okay, So there have been some videos lately by Tofu Goddess, and she kind of asked the question, why is it that left-wingers are associated with veganism and conservatives are not? Well, I think what's really important to draw attention to here is that some of the countries where veganism has been most successful are precisely the countries where veganism does rate, where veganism does resonate with conservative values, where it builds on folk customs or folk ways, and where conservatives can get behind or do tend to get behind, right? So first and foremost is Taiwan. Taiwan is, I think, the strongest vegan culture in the world. Conservative Taiwanese culture values veganism and the questions it raises, partly because it's a culture that's emerged out of a mix of Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, various Chinese cultural values, and of course also anti-communism. That whole island exists only in a struggle for its own survival against communist China. It's another story. But in those unique circumstances, when I was in Taiwan, I met really conservative, really macho ex-military guys who were vegan. No, I didn't meet 100 of them. I couldn't speak Chinese back then. But like, I met several of these guys, and it was when I talk about, like, yeah, that's like a known stereotype. The guy who gets out of the army and gets serious about veganism. Some of them were vegan while they were in the army. I asked them about that too. You know what I mean? Sort of mean old, we would say right wing, a mean old conservative guy. One of them was Special Forces. He was a real killer. He talked to me about what we did. We learned to strangle people and all that shit. He was a hands-on kind of guy in the army. And he was serious as hell about veganism. Let me tell you. Anyway, and he actually told me that he was a Buddhist, but I later found out he was a member of a Taoist group. Anyway, so this is a culture where veganism is thriving now, and it's thriving in part because it has roots in conservatism there. Not in Texas, right? I think not in England or Wales or most of Western Europe, but there's something for us to learn here, and it's not a broad generalization about the nature of conservatism unless we understand in this way. And I think the classical Edmund Burke sense that conservatism has to do with being rooted in folk ways, valuing those folk ways more than the potential for rational reform proceeding like lines drawn on a chalkboard or like, lines on a blank piece of paper, writing up a new constitution. That was a new idea then. Hey, we're just going to write a new constitution and change the whole country. The United States did it, France did it, and other countries like the Netherlands started to jump on the constitutional bandwagon. Writing a new constitution, to some extent, it can change a country overnight, but to some extent it can't. And you could say that conservatives are putting emphasis on the side of the equation where it doesn't. So Taiwan's one example. We're right now in Thailand. We went to a meeting of vegan activists here at a local restaurant, and I asked the question, seriously, does Thailand now have the potential to catch up with Taiwan this way? Thailand also a culture built in this case on Theravada Buddhism, but the Buddhist roots of the culture in so many ways. Nothing left-wing about being vegetarian here in Thailand. The concepts of left-wing and right-wing are a bit surreal in the Thai context. But, in the near political future for Thailand, I absolutely feel Thailand has the potential to catch up with Taiwan and become a really powerful, vegan culture. But not because of socialism, not because of communism, not even because of Bernie Sanders or that style of, not because of free healthcare or free university education or any of the ideas of the kind of Bernie Sanders moderate left. I don't even consider Bernie Sanders a socialist. I think of him as moderate left. But anyway, whatever. It has nothing to do with that, right? And the biggest question of all on the map is India. India, with its more than 1 billion people, and a culture that, of course, they used to have the monopoly on Buddhism. They don't anymore. Buddhism is now a small minority religion there. They have Buddhism, they have Hinduism, they have Jainism, they have all this discourse surrounding, killing animals and eating meat and drinking milk. It's a very complex, a murky picture. Obviously, India, their tradition really, the primary tradition there is vegetarianism, not veganism. But anyone who just does Wikipedia level reading about that will see there's an enormous potential there. And again, it is fundamentally, you could say, a conservative tendency. So I've used this example in conversation recently. I forget where. I forget if it was when we were talking to the other vegans or not. But I said, look, Taiwan is a country where women will literally reschedule their abortion after consulting a Buddhist monk to try to find the day on the calendar when the ghost of the aborted fetus is least likely to haunt them. That's conservative. That's folk ways. That is folk culture, folk religion. I mean, this is not a religion written down in any book. This is not, the Buddha taught blank. No, this is centuries of truly, we talk about traditional values. Fucking, Republicans listen to Britney Spears. They think Britney Spears in a tube top is traditional values. No, it ain't. Taiwan has got traditional values, let me trust you. But those are the people who are, inclined towards veganism, I think, more than anybody. Of course, the truth is more complicated than that. I could say a whole lot more about that. But you can see this raises really interesting questions about the present and future potential of veganism and its relationship to liberalism, conservatism, etc., in a much more dynamic way. The other big question, I'm not going to talk about it here, Anna Scanlon used to have a video talking about it, was the extent to which veganism in Israel is another big success story for veganism, is actually conservative in nature. And it links to conservative Judaism and the dietary regulations and a reaction to that. No, I do think vegans in Israel are going to be more left-wing than right-wing within the Israeli political spectrum, but I just say I think there are actually really important questions asked there. I think if you're doing serious social science research on veganism in Israel, one of the things to focus on is the extent to which it's not an exclusively left-wing or socialist thing, and that's probably why, some studies are saying they're above 5% vegans. Maybe you only get to being above 5% when you're not just a bunch of left-wing hippies, you're not just a bunch of socialists, but you appeal to at least people in the center, moderates, and maybe you'll start appealing to conservatives as well. But again, the meaning of conservatism is ultimately rooted in culture, folk culture, traditional values, folk ways, and bizarrely, Edmund Burke's critique of the French Revolution. Okay, I want to end this video with a thought experiment. A lot of people make videos here on YouTube with the premise, with the implicit assumption that vegan outreach and public education really matters. That is maybe the most important thing. What do I mean by this? Vegan, I mean somebody with a pamphlet walking up to you on the street, handing you a pamphlet and saying, go vegan. Okay, this is what we mean by vegan outreach. Some people think that's the core of the movement. That's what we ought to be devoting our money to and our time to. That's the most effective form of activism. Okay? If we really believe this, if we take this premise seriously, if vegan outreach does matter and does work, and we look at the current situation analytically, we would have to conclude that vegan outreach, as we're doing it, only works for left-wing people. That it totally, in a context like the United States of America. So we're not talking about Taiwan, not talking about India, Sri Lanka. We would have to come to the conclusion that we're somehow producing pamphlets that only people further to the left of Bernie Sanders respond to, right? If we really believe in this method of teaching and preaching veganism. Now, I don't. I'm an ultra skeptic about what's going on right now under the name of vegan outreach. I don't believe this. I think that way madness lies. We have groups like Direct Action Everywhere who say their methods are based on social science research and all this fabulous research they've done, learning the lessons of history. They've learned so much from studying the history of Mohandas Gandhi in India and of the Arab Spring after 2011. They say they've learned so much, and what's the best idea Direct Action Everywhere comes up with? Walk into a restaurant and demand to buy dog meat. And then when they don't have dog meat, throw a fit and say that dog meat is the same as cow meat in restaurants. Do you remember that? This is the fresh new idea they've come up with. And apparently this only appeals to left-wing extremists. And then they come on the internet and show you the video on YouTube of them doing this in a restaurant, them causing a scene in a restaurant, demanding dog meat. And they encourage you too, you and all your friends should go out and demand dog meat from the restaurant. This is quote-unquote disruption. This is going to change the world. This is going to save the animals. This is going to save the planet. No, it's not. But if we believe that, if this is your conviction, if you're someone who really believes in vegan outreach and these methods of activism and disruption, if you do, or if you want to analyze the current situation with that premise, treating it as valid until it's proven invalid, that's an important thing to do as a thought experiment, then you must come to the conclusion in the United States of America, in Canada, in Western Europe, we're using methods of outreach that don't work because they only work for the left-wing lunatic fringe. Now, I think I've presented this kind of 180 degrees opposite of what the real situation is. The real situation is you're using methods like this, like disruption from Direct Action Everywhere, that in fact are only appealing to people who are already deeply committed to they're not just Bernie Sanders people, but people who are communists or left-wing socialists, people who are far, far out in the left wing. They see those methods of street protest, of disruption, those types, and they think, oh, I can relate. This is the same thing I used to do when I was protesting in support of the Soviet Union or whatever it was. It relates to them on that aesthetic and political level as part of the same tradition of left-wing street activism. There are various reasons why. Okay, now if we flip this around and ask, what if outreach doesn't matter? What if this is basically something impotent and something, frankly, even ritualistic that we're doing as vegans? Then I think we start to take the steps towards the truth, which is that we're not living in a society where the body of vegans is constituted by people who at random happen to be handed a pamphlet on a university campus and who change their whole lives. We have clusters of people who become vegan because veganism presents them with answers to questions that they were asking themselves anyway. In Taiwan, I saw people who became vegan because they were asking questions that Buddhism couldn't answer. They were frustrated with Buddhism. They were dissatisfied with Buddhism. They said Buddhism is corrupt. Buddhism is failing to answer these questions about ecology. Buddhism is failing to ask these questions about war and the anti-war movement. People become vegan because of the anti-war movement. I mean, it's not that paradoxical. They already had these questions, whether they were left-wing or right-wing, and many of them, as I said, were conservative. They already had questions, and then they saw in veganism an answer. And you're looking at a really peculiar and cultural subgrouping. Some people, as you know, the questions were about having a heart attack, what have you. But I mean, probably, the big ones are of ethics, ecology, etc. that are going to get people to really commit to this lifestyle. So we're looking at a funny cross-section of people who, whether or not they were ever given a pamphlet, were already asking these questions and then found in veganism the answer. That's going to be your first 2% of the population who become vegan. And now we're looking at the next 2%, if we get there, if we can reach them, which is people who are not asking those questions, who are not into those questions yet. Can we lead them to ask those questions? Most of us have been through this with our own parents, right? So I cared about these questions, so I became vegan. I sit down with my own mom and say, Mom, do you ever ask yourself blank? Do you ever ask, is it possible for me to get you to question your assumptions in life? And my implicit point in this whole video is, if we even want to be as successful as Taiwan already is, if we want to be as successful, I think, as Israel is, and as places like Thailand and India have the potential to be, we have to be framing those questions. We have to be raising those doubts in a way that actually does resonate with conservatives, that does resonate with moderate people, with people at the center of the political spectrum. And walking into a restaurant and throwing a fit because they don't have dog meat, that ain't it. Okay, guys, there's a playlist I'll give the link to below this video, which is called Brass Tacks, and there I'm gathering my recent videos talking about practical questions, practical answers about how we move forward with the vegan movement. And, those are questions I've been asking to some extent on this channel all along, but from my perspective, I'm just gearing up. I've been talking about this stuff on YouTube for 3 years, but I'm finally going back to Canada. I'm finally going back to a country where I have the right to vote and to organize politically, so maybe we can finally start to make a difference.